There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the familiar quiet of a shared living room, and they slip past your defenses. You don't recognize them as turning points until much later, when you're tracing the map of your own history and you find a single, indelible point from which all roads diverge. For me, that moment was the specific weight of Julian's head on my shoulder, the soft scratch of his evening stubble against the collar of my shirt, and the profound, terrifying silence that filled the space between his sleeping breaths. It was a silence that contained every question I was too afraid to ask, and every answer I was convinced I would never receive. He was just my friend, my roommate, the fixed point around which my own quiet life orbited. And he was asleep. It was as simple and as impossibly complicated as that. In that moment, the entire architecture of my world, a structure I had so carefully built to keep my heart safe, began to show its first hairline cracks. It had been like that for a few weeks, this strange new ritual. It was a fragile truce negotiated without words, a treaty signed in the language of exhaustion and unspoken need. Before, our evenings had a predictable rhythm. We'd cook or order in, talk about our days, his a whirlwind of client calls and strategy decks, mine a quiet series of exposures and chemical baths in the darkroom I'd built in the spare closet. We were a study in contrasts. Julian moved through the world like a current, all energy and forward momentum, pulling people into his wake. I was a tidal pool, content in my stillness, observing the world from a place of quiet containment. Our friendship worked because of this balance. He brought the world to our small apartment, and I gave him a place to be quiet within it. He was the city, and I was the harbor. The foundation of us was laid years before, in the organized chaos of a university photography club. I was there for the craft, for the magic of watching an image emerge from nothing in a tray of developer. He was there, he'd later admit, because he'd lost a bet with his then-girlfriend, Amelia. He was all restless limbs and a smile that seemed too big for his face. Fumbling with a vintage camera he clearly didn't know how to use. I remember watching him from across the darkroom, the red safety light carving strange shadows onto his face, turning his casual confidence into something more vulnerable. He was trying to load a roll of film onto a developing reel, his large hands clumsy and frustrated. I'd seen a dozen beginners struggle with the same task. It was a tactile puzzle, one that required patience and a feel for the delicate curl of the celluloid. I almost didn't intervene. My natural inclination was to observe, not to engage, to document the struggle from a distance rather than alleviate it. But something in the slump of his shoulders, a flicker of genuine defeat in the set of his jaw, made me move. I walked over, my own hands still damp from the stop bath. "It's easier if you don't force it," I said, and my voice sounded unervingly loud in the hushed, chemical-scented air. He looked up, startled, and a small, embarrassed smile touched his lips. "I think I'm about to invent a new, much more expensive form of confetti," he'd replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the quiet of the room. I reached out, my fingers brushing his as I took the reel. "Let me show you," under the safety light. I guided his hands, showing him how to feel for the small ball bearings that would catch the film's edge, how to gently rock it back and forth until the entire roll was spooled. It was the first time I touched him, and I remember thinking how warm his hands were. It was a simple, clinical warmth, but my own fingers felt cold by comparison. That was the beginning. He never became a photographer. His patience ran too thin for the slow, deliberate art of it, but he became my friend. He was fascinated by my world, by the way I could find a story in a shadow or a poem in the reflection on a puddle. He'd sit on the stool in my darkroom, a silhouette in the red gloom, and just watch me work, asking questions about f-stops and focal lengths. He didn't need to understand the mechanics of it. He just seemed to like being in a space where things happened slowly, where an image was coaxed into existence rather than forced. In return, he pulled me out of my shell. He dragged me to parties where I knew no one, introduced me as his brilliantly artistic friend who sees the world in grayscale, and stood by my side until my social anxiety subsided into a manageable hum. He taught me how to navigate the bright, loud world he inhabited, and I gave him a key to my quiet one. I fell in love with him gradually, then all at once. It wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 tiny ones. It was the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely laughed. It was the fierce loyalty he showed to his friends, a protective instinct that was both intimidating and incredibly gentle. It was watching him explain a complex financial model to his younger sister over the phone, his voice patient and kind. I loved the way he filled a room, not with arrogance, but with a kind of effortless life force. He was sunlight, and I had spent my whole life in comfortable, predictable shade. My feelings for him became a room inside myself that I kept permanently locked. I was the only one with the key, and I never, ever went inside if I could help it. It was a place of deep, aching beauty and profound loneliness. I knew he was straight. I had watched him fall in and out of love with women, had offered him a shoulder to lean on during breakups, had even listened to him gush about new flames. I was his friend, the stable, reliable narrator of his life. And that was a role I was terrified of losing. To want more was to risk everything. So I packed my feelings away, like old photographs in a light-proof box, and resolved to be happy with the friendship we had. It was more than enough. It had to be. After college, we got an apartment together. It was a practical decision. He was starting a demanding job as a consultant, which meant long hours and frequent travel. I was trying to make a living as a freelance photographer, which meant an unpredictable income and a need for cheap rent. Sharing a place made sense. Our lives, already intertwined, became a shared domestic landscape. The coffee maker I bought, the ridiculous, oversized couch he insisted on, the stack of my photography books on the coffee table, his running shoes perpetually by the door. We built a home together, a space that was a perfect fusion of his chaos and my order. For 3 years, it worked. The locked room inside me stayed locked. I would watch him bring dates home, and I would feel a familiar, dull ache, but I would retreat to my darkroom, to the comforting solitude of my work, and the feeling would subside. I had my role, the quiet observer, the best friend. It was a good life, a safe life. Then came the shift. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic slide. Julian was on a massive, year-long project for his firm. It was the kind of make-or-break assignment that could define a young consultant's career. The pressure was immense. He was flying across the country twice a week, living out of hotels, subsisting on bad coffee and adrenaline. When he was home on weekends, he was a ghost. The vibrant energy that had always defined him was replaced by a bone-deep weariness. His eyes were perpetually shadowed, his movements heavy. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a tight, strained line. The project was also taking a toll on his relationship with Sarah, a lawyer he'd been seeing for about 6 months. Their phone calls, once full of laughter, became clipped and tense. I'd hear his side of the conversations through his closed bedroom door, his voice tight with frustration and exhaustion. The project imploded in spectacular fashion. A key client pulled out, the market shifted, and a year of his life's work dissolved into a series of apologetic emails and grim conference calls. He came home on a Thursday night, and I knew something was wrong the moment he walked through the door. He didn't drop his bags with his usual clatter. He just set them down gently, as if he didn't have the energy to make a sound. He walked into the living room, where I was editing a set of portraits, and just stood there. He looked hollowed out. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "The whole thing. Gone." I didn't know what to say. I just got up and put my arms around him. He was stiff at first, then he just seemed to collapse into the hug, his head resting on my shoulder. He felt impossibly heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire failed project in the slump of his spine. We stood like that for a long time, in the middle of our living room, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop screen. He didn't cry. He just breathed. Deep, shuddering breaths that felt like he was trying to pull air into lungs that had forgotten how. To make matters worse, Sarah broke up with him 2 days later. He told me about it in the same monotone voice. She said she needs someone who's actually present, he recounted, staring at a fixed point on the wall. I can't even be angry. She's right, he was adrift. The two main anchors of his life, his career momentum and his relationship, had been severed in the span of a single week. The confident, energetic man I knew was gone, and in his place was someone I barely recognized, someone lost and quiet and fragile. That was the night the ritual began. We were watching some mindless action movie, a blur of explosions and car chases that required zero emotional investment. It was late, past midnight. I was on one end of the giant couch, he was on the other. He had been silent for most of the movie, his gaze fixed on the screen but not really seeing it. At some point, he shifted, pulling a cushion behind his head. Then he shifted again, his body angled more toward my side of the couch. I was acutely aware of every movement, every subtle change in the space between us. My own body was rigid, a statue of feigned relaxation. The air was thick with his unhappiness, a palpable, heavy thing. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry all the stress of the past year. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "Yeah." I kept my eyes on the screen. "Is it okay if I—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he just moved. He swung his legs up onto the couch, stretched out, and rested his head in my lap. Just like that. No preamble, no negotiation. One moment, there was a careful, deliberate space between us. The next, his head was on my thighs, his hair tickling my jeans, his face turned away from me, toward the back of the couch. My entire body went into lockdown. Every muscle tensed. My breathing hitched. It was the most terrifying, most wonderful thing that had ever happened to me. 1,000,000 volts of pure, unfiltered panic and joy shot through my system. My hands, which had been resting on my stomach, were now frozen in midair. What was I supposed to do with them? Should I put them on his head? On his shoulder? Should I just let them hover there forever? The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the tinny sound of gunfire from the television. I could feel the warmth of him through my jeans, the rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. He was using me as a pillow. That's all it was. A human pillow. A friend, exhausted and heartbroken, seeking a moment of simple, physical comfort. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, a desperate prayer against the hope that was blooming, wild and treacherous, in my chest. I forced my breathing to even out, forced my shoulders to relax. After a few minutes that felt like a geological age, I slowly, carefully, lowered one of my hands and let it rest on his shoulder. His body didn't react. He just sank a little deeper, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. And then, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He fell asleep in my lap. My best friend. The man I was hopelessly, secretly in love with. I sat there for over an hour, pinned to the couch by the weight of him and the even greater weight of my own feelings. I studied the curve of his ear, the way a few strands of his dark hair curled just behind it. I watched the steady pulse in his neck. The room was dark except for the flickering light of the television, which cast shifting colors across his sleeping face. It was an image I wanted to capture, to develop and keep forever. It was a moment of impossible intimacy, born of his pain and my silence. When the movie ended and the credits rolled, I didn't move. I couldn't. I was terrified that if I shifted, if I breathed too loudly, the spell would break. He would wake up, realize what he was doing, and retreat back to his side of the chasm that had always existed between what I felt and what he knew. Eventually, my legs started to go numb. I knew I had to move him. Gently, so gently, I shook his shoulder. "Julian," I whispered. His name felt foreign and heavy on my tongue. He mumbled something incoherent, shifting slightly, but not waking. "Julian, come on. Let's get you to bed." I tried again, a little louder this time. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open for a second before closing again. He was completely out of it. With a sigh that was part frustration and part something else, a tender, aching fondness, I decided to just haul him there. I managed to get my arms under his shoulders and knees, and with a grunt of effort, I lifted him. He was heavier than I expected, a dead weight of muscle and bone and pure exhaustion. I half-carried, half-dragged him down the short hallway to his room. His head lolled against my chest, his breath warm on my neck. The proximity was dizzying. I could smell his shampoo, a faint scent of sandalwood, and something clean and uniquely Julian. I deposited him onto his bed as gently as I could. He landed with a soft hump on the mattress and immediately curled onto his side, pulling the duvet around himself without ever truly waking. I stood there for a moment, watching him in the dim light filtering in from the hallway. His room was a mess, clothes strewn on a chair, books piled on the floor. It was the landscape of his recent chaos. I pulled the duvet up over his shoulder, my fingers brushing against his neck for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a small electric shock. I pulled my hand back as if burned. I backed out of the room, pulling the door almost closed, leaving just a sliver of light from the hall spilling onto his floor. I went back to the living room and sank onto the couch, my leg tingling as the feeling returned. The indentation where his head had been was still warm. I touched the spot on my jeans, and the phantom weight of him was still there. It wasn't nothing. My logical mind screamed at me that it was just a moment of weakness, of need. But the part of me that lived in that locked room, the part that had been starved for so long, was whispering that it was everything. That night was the template. It became our new normal, a silent agreement. A few nights later, it happened again. Another movie, another late hour. This time, there was less hesitation. He just shifted, laid his head down, and was asleep within minutes. I was more prepared. I let my hand rest on his back this time, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. It felt right. It felt like this was a thing I was meant to do, to be the anchor that kept him from drifting away completely. The couch became our space. It was a neutral territory where the lines could blur under the guise of friendship and fatigue. Some nights he would talk, his voice low and muffled by the cushions, telling me about the frustrating search for a new project, the empty feeling of his days. He wasn't looking for advice. He was just thinking aloud, using my presence as a sounding board. And then, inevitably, his words would trail off, and he would fall asleep. The ritual began to escalate in small, almost imperceptible ways. One night, instead of just his head in my lap, he stretched out fully, his arm draped casually across my stomach. I held my breath, waiting for him to move it, but he didn't. He was already asleep. His hand rested just above my hip, his fingers slightly curled. I could feel the warmth of his palm through my t-shirt. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond the established boundaries of our friendship, that it felt like I was breaking a law just by allowing it. But I couldn't bring myself to move his hand. It felt like a tether, a fragile connection I was desperate to maintain. I would sit there for hours, my heart pounding a frantic, silent rhythm against my ribs, analyzing every detail. The weight of his arm, the texture of his skin, the way his breathing would sometimes catch in a small, soft snore. I became a connoisseur of his sleep. I lived for those nights, and I dreaded them. They were a beautiful, exquisite torture. They fed the part of me I had tried so hard to starve, giving it just enough hope to keep it alive. During the day, we would revert to our old roles. We'd talk, laugh, make coffee, and pretend that nothing had happened the night before. We never spoke of it. Not once. It was a secret we kept together, without ever acknowledging that it was a secret. This plausible deniability was his shield, but it was my prison. Was he just using me for comfort, completely oblivious to the turmoil he was causing inside me? Or did he know? Did he feel even a fraction of what I felt? The question was a constant, low-grade hum in the back of my mind. I started to see it as a kind of photography project. I was documenting the subtle shifts in our relationship, collecting moments instead of images. I was an observer of my own life, framing each interaction, looking for the hidden meaning, the truth in the shadows. His loneliness was the subject, and my couch was the studio. But I was also in the picture, and I couldn't maintain my professional distance. I was becoming part of the composition, my own feelings developing in the dark, threatening to overexpose the entire image. Then came the night of the open door. It had been a particularly bad day for him. A promising job lead had fallen through at the last minute. He was quiet all evening, a tense, coiled energy radiating from him. We didn't even bother with a movie. We just sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us. Around 11, he stood up. "I'm going to bed," he said, his voice rough. He walked down the hall to his room, and I heard his door click shut. It was the first night in weeks he hadn't fallen asleep on the couch. A cold, sharp disappointment pierced through me, immediately followed by a wave of guilt. How had I come to expect it? To need it? I had let the ritual become a dependency. I stayed on the couch, unable to settle. The apartment felt too big, too empty, without his sleeping presence beside me. After about an hour, I got up to get a glass of water. As I walked past his room, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was ajar, just a few inches, a dark vertical slash in the white wall. He always slept with his door firmly shut. Always. It was one of his quirks. He said he couldn't sleep if he felt exposed. My heart started to pound. Was it an accident? Or was it an invitation? Another unspoken question hanging in the air. I stood there for a full minute, my mind racing. I could just go to my own room, get into my own bed, and end the uncertainty. It was the safe thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do. I did not do the sensible thing. I pushed the door open, just a little more, and peered inside. "Julian," I whispered. There was no answer. In the faint moonlight filtering through his window, I could see his shape under the duvet, a restless lump. He was tossing and turning, muttering in his sleep. He was having a nightmare. I could see the tension in his body, even from the doorway. Without thinking, I walked into the room and sat on the edge of his bed. The mattress dipped under my weight. He immediately went still. His muttering stopped. It was as if my presence alone had calmed the storm in his subconscious. "Leo." His voice was thick with sleep, but it was lucid. He had been awake. Or my presence had woken him. "You were having a nightmare," I said softly. My voice felt loud in the stillness. He rolled over to face me, his eyes barely open. "Yeah," he breathed. "A bad one." He didn't elaborate. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dark. The space between us was charged with a new kind of tension. This wasn't the couch. This was his bed. This was his private space. I had crossed a threshold. I should have left. I should have said, "Okay, well, good night," and walked out. But I was rooted to the spot, held there by the silent pull of his gaze. Then he did something that shattered the last remnants of my self-control. He lifted the edge of the duvet. An invitation. It was clear, unambiguous, and utterly terrifying. It was one thing to fall asleep on a couch. It was another thing entirely to be invited into someone's bed. My mind was screaming 1,000 warnings. "This is a mistake. You're misreading this. He's just lonely and upset. Don't do it. Just for a bit," he whispered, as if he could hear my internal debate. I don't want to be alone right now." His vulnerability was a disarming weapon. It bypassed all my defenses. I kicked off my shoes, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. I slid under the covers, my body rigid with anxiety. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of him lying next to me, just inches away. The bed was a universe. The space between our bodies was a galaxy of unspoken things. The air was electric. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. For a long time, neither of us moved. We just lay there, breathing in the dark. Then, slowly, tentatively, he shifted closer. He turned onto his side, facing me. I felt his arm come to rest on my stomach, in the now familiar position from the couch. But this was different. This was intentional. He wasn't asleep. His hand was warm and steady. Then he moved again, pressing his forehead against my shoulder. I could feel his breath, warm and even, on my neck. My entire being was focused on that single point of contact. It was the epicenter of a seismic event that was rearranging my entire inner world. I finally found the courage to move. I turned my head, just slightly, until my cheek was resting against the top of his head. His hair was soft. I closed my eyes, breathing in his scent. Sandalwood. And sleep. And him. In that moment, lying in the dark, with his head on my shoulder and his arm across my chest, the locked room inside me burst open. The feelings I had kept contained for so long came flooding out, not in a violent torrent, but in a quiet, overwhelming tide of pure, unadulterated love. It was terrifying, and it was peaceful. For the first time, the place where he was and the place where I wanted him to be were the same. I fell asleep like that, not knowing what the morning would bring, but for the first time in years, not entirely afraid to find out. The morning brought with it a fragile, uncertain peace. I woke up first. Sunlight was streaming through the gap in his curtains, painting a bright stripe across the far wall. Julian was still asleep, his body curled against mine, his arms still draped over my chest. His face, in the soft morning light, was relaxed. The lines of stress and exhaustion that had become so familiar were smoothed away. He looked younger. He looked like the boy I'd met in the darkroom all those years ago. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, trying to memorize every detail of the moment. This was uncharted territory. The couch had its plausible deniability. This had none. We had woken up in the same bed, entangled like lovers. I knew I should move, get up, put some space between us before he woke up and the inevitable awkwardness descended. But I couldn't. I was selfishly hoarding these last few moments of quiet intimacy. Eventually, he started to stir. He made a soft noise in the back of his throat and shifted, pressing his face more firmly into my shoulder. Then his eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, his gaze unfocused. Then it cleared, and he realized where he was. He saw me. I saw the exact moment recognition dawned, followed by a flicker of something else in his eyes. Panic? Confusion? I couldn't tell. He pulled back instantly, as if he'd touched a hot stove. He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. Oh, he said. Right, he wouldn't look at me. He was already building a wall, brick by silent brick. Morning, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally casual. I sat up too, putting a careful distance between us. The warmth where he had been was already fading, replaced by a spreading chill. I should get some coffee going, he mumbled, swinging his legs out of bed. He stood up and walked out of the room without a backward glance. I was left sitting in his messy bed, the scent of him still on the pillows, the ghost of his warmth beside me. The beautiful, peaceful moment had shattered, and the silence he left behind was not comfortable. It was jagged and sharp. I had crossed a line, and now I was paying the price. The hope that had bloomed so brightly the night before was already wilting. The next few days were excruciating. The ritual was broken. He didn't fall asleep on the couch. He would retreat to his room early, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a judgment. The easy camaraderie we had always shared was replaced by a strained, polite distance. We were roommates again, two separate entities sharing a physical space, but nothing else. We talked about the weather, about groceries, about anything and everything except the one thing that was screaming in the silence between us. He was avoiding my eyes. He was avoiding me. My mind went into overdrive, analyzing and reanalyzing every moment of that night. Had I imagined the invitation in his eyes? Had I projected my own desires onto his simple need for comfort? The shame was a physical weight in my chest. I had been arrogant. I had mistaken his vulnerability for something else, something meant for me, and I had been wrong. The locked room inside me was not only open, it was ransacked, its contents exposed and cheapened in the harsh light of day. The pain of his distance was far worse than the ache of my secret love had ever been. At least before, I had the comfort of our friendship. Now it felt like I had nothing. After a week of this Cold War, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was poisoning the air in our apartment, the home we had built together. It felt like the developer in a tray that had been left out too long, turning from a medium of creation into a toxic, black sludge. I knew that if I didn't do something, our friendship, the most important relationship in my life, would be permanently damaged. It might already be too late. The fear of losing him completely was finally greater than my fear of the truth. I found him in the living room, staring out the window at the city lights. He had that same hollowed-out look he'd worn the night his project collapsed. He looked lost again. My anger and hurt softened into a familiar ache of concern. I took a deep breath. This was it. Julian, I said. He turned, his expression guarded. Hey, we need to talk. The words felt heavy, like stones I had to pull from my throat. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally met my eyes. I know, he said softly. Leo, I'm sorry. I don't know what I've been. What are we doing? The question came out more vulnerable than I intended. What is all this? The couch, the other night. I need to understand. Because I feel like I'm going crazy. He looked away again, his jaw working. He paced to the other side of the room, putting the giant couch between us like a barricade. I don't know, he said, his voice tight. I've been so messed up. Everything fell apart at once, and you were just there. You're always there. You're solid. And I leaned on you. Too hard. I used your kindness, and I'm sorry. It wasn't fair to you. His words were a punch to the gut. Used your kindness. He was framing it as a one-sided transaction, him taking and me giving. He was trying to erase the intimacy, to file it away under the neat, clean label of friendship under duress. He was trying to put things back in the box, to lock that door again. And I couldn't let him. Was that all it was? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Was I just a convenient pillow? A warm body in the dark? He flinched, as if I'd slapped him. No, he said quickly. No, of course not. It's just, Leo, it's complicated, then uncomplicated for me, Julian. I said, my patience finally snapping. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you're terrified of something, and you're making me pay the price for it. 1 minute, you're inviting me into your bed because you don't want to be alone, and the next, you can barely look at me. You don't get to do that. You don't get to pull me in and then push me away without an explanation. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes wide with a kind of desperate turmoil. He looked trapped. I don't know how to explain it, he burst out, his voice cracking with emotion. I don't understand it myself. I lie down next to you, and for the first time in months, my brain shuts up. The anxiety stops. Everything just stops. And it feels good. It feels right. And then I wake up, and I see you there. And my first thought is that I don't want to move. Ever. And that terrifies me. Leo, he finally said it. He finally admitted it. The relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. He wasn't just using me. He was just as confused and scared as I was. He took a ragged breath, his face pale. I've spent my whole life on a specific track, he continued, his voice softer now, full of a dawning, painful self-awareness. You go to school, you get the job, you meet a girl, you build a life. That's the map I was given. And you're not on the map, Leo. And it scares the hell out of me that you might be the place I was trying to get to all along. The silence that followed his confession was different. It wasn't empty or jagged. It was full. It was full of his fear, his confusion, and a truth so raw and unexpected it seemed to hum in the air between us. He had taken the jumbled, chaotic feelings he had, and, in his own clumsy, terrified way, he had developed them into a clear image. He had articulated the very thing I had never dared to hope for. I walked around the couch, closing the distance between us. I stood in front of him, close enough to see the tears welling in his eyes. He looked like a man confessing to a crime he didn't know he was capable of committing. You don't have to be scared, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Whatever this is, we can figure it out. But you have to stop running. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a week. The guard was down, the walls were gone. All I saw was Julian. My Julian. Lost and scared and beautiful. And then, he asked the question that changed everything. He didn't move. He just stood there, vulnerable and exposed, and whispered, Leo? I'm here. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The city outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the frantic beating of my own heart. It all went silent. His question wasn't one of passion or desire in the way you see in movies. It was a question of permission, of uncertainty. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to me. He was asking for a new map. He was asking me to help him draw it. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. So I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. He leaned in slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to pull away. His eyes were open, searching mine, asking the same question over and over without a sound. I didn't pull away. I met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of fireworks and explosions. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It tasted of salt from his unshed tears, and of a deep, profound relief. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the end of the silence. It was the beginning of everything else. When we finally broke apart, we just rested our foreheads together, breathing the same air. The silence that returned was a comfortable one, a peaceful one. It was the silence of two people who had finally found their way home, even if the landscape was entirely new and frighteningly beautiful. The kiss was not a magic wand. It didn't instantly solve everything. In fact, in the days that followed, a new kind of uncertainty settled in, but it was a shared one. The aftermath was tender and strange, like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. The ground is still cold, but you can feel the promise of warmth. We were clumsy. We didn't know the new rules because we were writing them as we went. The first morning after the kiss, I woke up in my own bed, alone. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had all been a dream, that the confession and the kiss were just a fantasy my lonely mind had concocted. Then I walked into the kitchen, and Julian was there, making coffee. He looked up when I entered, and a shy, uncertain smile touched his lips. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I made you coffee," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Thanks," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. He handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact lingered for a moment longer than necessary. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement. A confirmation. Yes, that happened. Yes, it was real. We were building a new language, one made of small gestures and shared glances. The grand, sweeping declarations weren't his style, and they weren't mine either. Our vocabulary was composed of him leaving the last of the good bread for me, of me making sure his favorite mug was clean. It was him asking about the photos I was developing, his interest now carrying a different weight, a personal investment. It was me listening to him talk about new job possibilities, not as his anchor in a storm, but as his partner on the shore. The couch ritual returned, but it was transformed. It was no longer born of his desperation and my secret longing. It was now an act of intention. We would put on a movie, and he would stretch out and rest his head in my lap, and I would thread my fingers through his hair without a moment's hesitation. There was no more anxiety, no more overanalysis. The plausible deniability was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid certainty. It was simply what we did. It was part of the texture of our evenings, as normal as dimming the lights or arguing over what to watch. He was no longer just seeking comfort, we were sharing it. The act itself hadn't changed, but its meaning had been completely rewritten. It was no longer a question. It was a statement. There were still moments of fear, mostly from him. I would sometimes catch him looking at me with a flicker of that old panic in his eyes, the ghost of the map he had thrown away. One evening, as we were lying on the couch, he suddenly went very still. "What is this, Leo?" he asked quietly, his voice muffled against my shirt. "What are we?" The question hung in the air. He needed a label, a word to put on the new shape of his life. He was a consultant. He dealt in definitions and frameworks. I thought for a moment, my hand stroking his back in slow, steady circles. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Does it matter right now? Right now, we're just this. We're two people on a couch. You're here. I'm here. Is that enough for now?" He was silent for a long time. I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the frantic whirring of his thoughts. Then, he let out a long, slow breath, and the tension seemed to drain out of him. He nestled his head more firmly against my chest. "Yeah," he whispered. "For now, that's enough." It was a breakthrough. He was learning to be comfortable in the ambiguity, to trust the feeling more than the definition. He was learning to navigate without his old map, using a different kind of compass, one that pointed not toward a predetermined destination, but simply toward me. My quiet patience, which I had once seen as a passive trait, became my greatest strength. I could give him the time he needed. I could be the calm space where he could figure himself out without pressure. My love for him, once a source of secret pain, had become a source of healing for both of us. Slowly, our private world began to expand. The first time he held my hand in public was a moment of quiet, heart-stopping terror and triumph. We were walking home from a late dinner, the streets mostly empty. He had been quiet, and I worried he was retreating again. Then his hand found mine. He just slipped his fingers between mine and held on, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if daring the world to challenge him. I looked at our joined hands, this simple, profound connection, and I felt a wave of love for him so powerful it almost stole my breath. He was so brave, braver than I had ever been. He was actively choosing this, actively choosing me, in the light of day. Our apartment, which had once been a landscape of platonic boundaries and unspoken tensions, became a sanctuary. The geography of our lives shifted. His bedroom door was no longer a symbol of separation or a tentative invitation. Most nights, it stayed open because he would end up in my room anyway. My bed, once my solitary island, became our shared continent. We would lie awake in the dark, not always touching, but simply existing in the same space, the comfortable silence a testament to how far we had come. We would talk about everything and nothing, our childhoods, our fears, our stupidest dreams. He told me about the pressure he'd always felt from his father to be a certain kind of man. I told him about the loneliness I'd felt as a kid, always on the outside looking in, a feeling that had drawn me to photography, to a life behind the lens. We were filling in the empty spaces in each other's histories, developing the negatives of our pasts into a shared story. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. I found Julian in the kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts that was too small for him, humming off-key to some song on the radio. He had a smudge of flour on his cheek. He was trying to make pancakes. The scene was so absurdly, beautifully domestic that I just stood in the doorway and watched him. He wasn't the dynamic, high-powered consultant. He wasn't the lost, broken man. He was just Julian, in my kitchen, making a mess and being happy. He saw me and his face broke into that huge, crinkling smile that I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Don't judge my technique," he warned, pointing a spatula at me. "These are either going to be pancakes or a single, very large pancake." I walked over and wiped the flour from his cheek with my thumb. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing for a brief second. "I don't care what they are," I said softly. "As long as you made them." He kissed me then, a quick, flour-dusted kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of a slow morning together. It was a simple, ordinary moment, the kind that happens every day in countless homes around the world. But for me, it was extraordinary. It was the culmination of years of silent yearning, of patient waiting, of terrifying risks and tentative steps. It was the quiet, unassuming reality of a love I had once been convinced could only exist in a locked room inside my own head. We never did have a big conversation where we defined our relationship. We never had to. We just were. We were the guys who spent weekends hiking in the nearby hills, me with my camera, him with an uncharacteristic patience, happy to wait while I framed the perfect shot. We were the guys who hosted dinner parties where our friends, after an initial period of slight confusion, simply accepted us as a unit, a natural pairing they just hadn't seen before. We were the guys who fell asleep on the couch, not out of necessity, but out of habit, out of love. I think back to that first night, to the weight of his head on my shoulder and the terror and hope that filled me. I had been so afraid of that moment, so convinced that wanting more would mean losing everything. I had viewed my love for him as a liability, a secret that could destroy the foundation of our friendship. But I was wrong. It was the foundation. It was the solid ground beneath our feet all along. We just had to be brave enough to look down. There's a photograph I took of him a few months after that first kiss. He's asleep on the couch, just like all those times before. The late afternoon sun is streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. One of my hands is in his hair, and my other hand is holding the camera. It's technically a bad photograph, a selfie, really, with a strange angle and soft focus. But it's my favorite, because it's not a picture of a man who is lost, and it's not a picture of a man who is lonely. It's a picture of a man who is home. And in the reflection in the camera lens, you can just make out my own face, and for the first time, I look like a man who is home, too. We had navigated the darkness, the confusion, the fear of the unknown territory between us, and we had found our way not to a predetermined destination on a map, but to each other. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of the quiet, steady rhythm of a shared life.